Okay, so starting my speech in 3, 2. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So firstly, I'm going to characterize what this form of social advocacy means, and then I'm going to talk about how we lead to more mobilization on our side, and lastly, the kind of social change we achieve on our side, and why it's exclusive and achieved faster and better on our comparative. Right? So first of all, this form of advocacy is a positive means of expression of individuals' identity, right? So instead of the larger scale or what happens in the status quo, where people communicate their pain and the shitty things that they go through, this one focuses on people expressing their identity and the uniqueness that it comes with. So it usually talks about how these identities are unique to their actualization as individuals, and why it's not why it should be something that should be celebrated, and why it should be something that should be accepted by the larger society, right? And also, these methods usually apply to social groups that already have some level of acceptance, so i.e. LGBTQ people in the United States, or women in developed countries in Africa like Ghana and South Africa, right? So they have some level of acceptance in the society, but they just need to engage in more advocacy to make the general populace know more about the things that they go through and their unique identities, right? And so this form of advocacy preaches positivity about the uniqueness of identity and why people should allow them to freely exist within these places, right? And also, it usually makes a lot of minorities and people that goes through this suffering opt into this social movement, right? Because it's a means of escaping and expressing your identity, insofar as the larger society has prevented you from expressing it in the status quo. So what is the first benefit, right? Why do we get more mobilization for this social movement on our comparative? Number one, people can easily bandwagon on this because of the positivity that it comes with, right? So, i.e., people expressing the uniqueness of their identity, i.e., the minorities in themselves want to opt into this because the larger society shuns them, and this is a means for them to express themselves. Number two, people of the majority groups of people who are the middle liners would want to opt into this. Why? Because this is usually a safe means of advocacy. This does not usually come with the adversarial nature and the tense atmosphere that normal advocacy mechanisms comes with in the status quo, right? That means that a lot more people want to hop onto this and want to buy into it. And also, oftentimes, people just want an escape from reality and showcase their identity, especially the minorities. They are tired of always complaining. They are tired of all the bad things that they go through. This gives them massive amounts of headache. They want to escape these realities, right? And so this is a means for them to express themselves and showcase their identities. So over here, we unlock one benefit. We give the means for minorities who constantly go through pain in all their existence. We unlock one benefit for them to freely exist because this is a safe space for them, and there's no threat of police intervention and law enforcement clashes and stuff like this. Because these forms of advocacy are usually peaceful in nature. It's just people dancing around and singing and stuff like that. So there's a likelihood that there'll be police and clash, and those things are things that are largely unexistent. So first benefit, we unlock more mobilization on our side. Why is this mobilization relevant in status quo, and why is it exclusive? Because number one, on the comparative, it's difficult for people to be able to opt into this social advocacy. Why? Because most people are scared, like you that, oh, advocacy is going to shoot you and stuff like that.
I'm sorry.
A lot more people are scared. You have less option on their
I can't hear them. Is it just me?
No, you are dropping off from the connection.
Oh. How many seconds? Is it me or the judge who is dropping off?
You were not audible to more people than just me, so I assume it's you. Maybe if people that are not speaking could turn off their cameras to just save a bit of bandwidth, that might help.
Yeah.
I have you at 3 minutes and 40 seconds left.
40 seconds left.
3 minutes and 40 seconds.
Okay. Okay, so is it okay now? Can everybody hear me so I can continue with my speech?
I hear you well now.
Okay, so I'm going to continue my speech in 3, 2, 1. So the relevance of the mobilization that you get is number one, people are in touch with their inner identities, right? That means that they would want more to talk about these issues on social media. They liked how they're able to carry, dildo hats or vagina hats on the social advocacy, right? That means that this is something that gives them actualization. They would want to talk about it more. That means that they'll go to things like social media, tell their friends about it and stuff like that, right? That means that you get more advocacy, you get more discourse on our side, right? And this is likely to expand and go through like larger like media platforms and news agencies. Why? Because this is a new way of engaging advocacy, and that means that media is likely to opt into this, right? Everybody is tired of you protesting and stuff like that. But then more people speaking means that you have more discourse and you create more awareness, and more people can hop on these things, right? And that's the unique benefit you get on our side. The next thing I'm going to talk about is agency, right? Because the major thing that UP is going to be pushing is that, well, when you protest and talk about issues, you create agency and all those things. I have 3 observations to note here. Number one, more people hopping on this means that you showcase that more people identify with that specific inability to express their identity, means that they want a way to express their identity, right? That means that more people hopping on this means that you showcase that there's more agency because more people are doing this. But then number 2, agency is communicated by the number of people that identify with these issues, right? But then number 3, when you portray the uniqueness of your specific identity, right? And people look at how unique your identity is, they now understand that, oh, systems or society or law enforcement or state have made you unable to express that identity that is unique to your to your actualization, right? And this creates more empathy as opposed to the other side where people usually tag these groups and vilify them. But when you express your identity, people know that, oh, well, you're just looking for an escape to express your identity because the state and other systems have infringed upon your right to express them, right? That means that you create more empathy, and empathy is a spark that brings agency, right? Because people are empathetic to your situation, they find it urgent. Before I move on, I'll take a POI from closing up.
We
3.
think the link about how you express yourself more is missing. You never showed us why this happy pride parades will make you express your problems more.
I think I did that. I showed how your comparative, people are scared to opt into advocacy mechanisms that exist on your comparative, right? Because of clashes with law enforcement and stuff like that. And also, I explained how people are tired of usually complaining. They just want an escape to express their unique identities. What are the impacts on our side? You have 3 things. Number 1, policy making. Because you have more numbers on our side, governments are more likely to pander to your side and create policy directions, right? But number 2, political parties are more likely to create policies in your favor, right? Because they want to affect the larger number of people, because those are the people that they get their votes from. As compared to your side, where less people opt into these things because of all the mechanisms I've explained, that means that political parties are disincentivized from opting into your side. But number 3, people feel more confident about opting into these specific minority groups. And also, that's bandwagoning effect. The fact that everybody's opting into it makes everyone else want to opt into it. That means that you have more numbers, and political parties and states can easily opt into this. Why is it something that is unique? Because number 1, on the other side, you can easily vilify them and paint them as bad actors, right? And that means that there's less incentive to create policies in their directions, because you can easily counter them and say, oh, well, these guys are just bad guys trying to destroy the security in our state and stuff like that, right? And also, because on the other side, it's easy to clash with law enforcement on the other side, you can easily vilify them and deny them, right? And deny them of the things that are essential to the actualization, i.e. the policy and stuff like that, right? And also, the vilification on the other side means that you lose more sympathy, right? And that means that political parties cannot respond to you any longer, and that's why the award is very problematic. Proudly opening government.
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize it was on. We thank the Prime Minister for this fine speech, and we call upon the Leader of the Opposition to continue this debate. Here.
Hi, sorry, just give me like 30 seconds. I'll start within the minute, just a moment.
Are you ready?
Yep, sorry about that. I'm going to assume I'm audible and visible, and you should just let me know. I'll take a POI at 4. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The way social movements succeed today is not through their promotion as a joyful, open group with many festivities, but as a group with real, immediate grievances that must also be that must primarily be addressed through change if society wants to heal and improve itself. I think the overall priority of joyful militancy contradicts, therefore, the sentiments of anger and the impetus to action and solidarity that's created as a result of that anger, and that is why we oppose. Just to be clear, I don't think on our side we have to defend the most violent or vehement modes of protest. I think clearly what the motion clarifies is that we would rather have modes of like civil disobedience, sit-ins, organizing, like protests where people criticize the government or like criticize policies that are anti-LGBT, anti-democracy, anti-whatever. Have, I guess, protests where in general people are not so much focused on festivities or like singing together or showcasing their pride and culture, but rather focus around solidarity, around grievances, around actively harmful things that are happening to LGBT youth or whoever is being oppressed in this case. So I think it's fair to say that on our side of the house, we're actively promoting modes of protest and just in general showcasing your grievances through civil modes that are not necessarily focused on festivities, but more on negative emotions, on ways in which people are more focusing on negative messaging. For example, the state is doing this messed up thing. These people are doing these messed up things to us, and we want these specific things to change. Okay, so what then am I going to talk on this speech? 3 things. Firstly, why the social movement loses urgency on that side. Secondly, why this hurts people inside the movement and fractures it. And thirdly, what does this mean for the overall perception of the movement in society? Okay, so just to respond on the whole stuff about escaping reality and how this helps you showcase pride from OG, right? I think immediately this is dealt with by the sense of urgency that's created on our side, right? At the point at which your active reality right now is being oppressed and discriminated against by policy and by people every day. I think it's not fair to say that it's okay to escape. It's not fair to say that people should therefore escape this reality, because this reality is supposed to be making you miserable today. And right now, your overall focus there should be to focus on why people are making you so miserable, and therefore try to promote change that deals with this reality in which you are always crushed by the power of institutions, government, or other people in society. Okay, so first thing then on urgency. I think with like LGBT, pro-democracy, or feminist movements, all the problems right now are being felt immediately in the form of rights being curtailed, right, and stripped and denied. And so given that you are actively discriminated against, abused, and not being legally represented or protected as a citizen, the focus on positivity then uniquely makes these things seem like they don't matter as much anymore, right? Because I think when people say the activism, it means like in the media, it means like, again, you're focusing on the modes of showing your pride about your culture, showing your happiness about the hope that there is in the community. These things uniquely, unfortunately, take away from the space you have in the media or in the broader discourse and dialogue in society from talking about the problems that you have and the negative emotions around which you feel because you are oppressed by these problems every day. In the media, what does it mean, right? Because I think it means less meaningful coverage that promotes active change, right? Because the fact of the matter is, structurally speaking, news agencies, I think, tend to react to negativity more viscerally, right? Like sorrow and anger, more visually and immediately as well, right? Because people showcasing pride and positivity versus, for example, people being angry about LGBT youth dying and being and killing themselves, and obviously other minority groups being like oppressed and like actually dying every day. These are things that again are highlighted more viscerally, and I think people are tend to focus more on them because of the sort of graphic depictions and the sort of visceral ways in which they stand out more in the medium, as opposed to just people being happy, right? The effect of this is that on their side, media and audiences tend to focus more on the method, right? Whether it's parades, whether it's like singing songs together, whether it's just in general positive messaging versus negative messaging about problems that are actually happening on the ground and what therefore needs to change. So I think even if you're saying, for example, the result is that people recognize that maybe these groups deserve more of a space, I think there's a much less sense that there is a problem to begin with, that there is urgency, that people are actually needing to solve this problem right now when people are clearly being happy and content, right? It's a lot harder to create that sense of agency, that urgency on their side of the house when people are no longer as visibly upset. Then OG on empathy, right? They say mobilization. Sure, many people may know about these things now, but that's the same for our side. And it's unclear why they care enough on their side of the house, why they create more empathy versus on our side, when basic rights such as just being able to exist, being able to have the freedom of expression are things that also everyday people care about and would obviously also care about if the government is curtailing it for a certain group of people. The perception on their side, therefore, is that I think you make these movements seem a lot more insular as a cultural group, because it seems as though as long as there's a space for these people to speak up, why are we so angry? Why do we necessarily want to care about them as much anyway? So I don't think they actually prove empathy uniquely as beneficial for their side. The second thing on why this is bad for the movement then, and fractures it within and lets the most vulnerable people inside down the solution and likely to leave. I think for vulnerable people every day, like poor people within the movement or those who are from especially conservative households, where your parents and your community members are actively isolating and marginalizing you every day, there's no support for you anyways, right? So this policy is inherent, so this movement, this strategy is inherently bad in that it asks these people to suppress those immediate real grievances, go against the natural instincts you have to express sorrow, and instead partake in festivities, right? This is inherently a very privileged attitude that dismisses or expects these people, these disenfranchised people, the most disenfranchised in the movement, to dismiss their emotions and instead showcase pride. That increases the feeling of being alone and isolated, and then that therefore leads to a moment where you feel like you can relate to the movement even less and less, right? For the movement, this is bad then, because your ability as a social movement to assess the strength and reality of people on the ground decreases, and that is why you are less able to hold on to your members and actually make it seem as though there's a place for your members, especially the most disenfranchised, to stay in it and have support structures when you are focusing on positivity, things that they cannot tap into because they are not positive, because they're sad and also suffering every day. Before I move on, is there a point? Okay, I'm gonna move on. Yes. Yeah, so I think the stuff about, for example, confidence is that closing? Go ahead.
Yeah. So you need to be able to point out exactly how all these individuals who are constantly facing direct.
Okay, sorry, I'm just gonna move on. Okay, so what is our mechanism then? I think our counterfactual is unity through negative emotions such as anger, right? I think the crucial point on our to the house is that identification happens uniquely. Identification with the cause uniquely happens through repeated shows of anger and sadness, right? Because I think at the point at which your everyday rights, such as being able to speak up, such as being able to just exist without being tortured, without being discriminated, these are things that everyday average people can relate to, and also again, the most vulnerable people in your movement are suffering from every day. That's why you create more unity in the movement at the point at which your movement says these are problems that we know you are facing, and that we are therefore going to create a space for you to protest about. That's the point at which I think the visibility matters more in the media, and that's the point at which you also allow the movement to assess its strength more down the road. Because in the long run, at the point at which you have more solidarity and unity around these negative emotions, which everyday people feel, and a lot more people can vastly relate to, and don't have to go get the active instincts to showcase, but can actually just show their everyday existence of suffering. That's when people feel less alone and feel like you can actually rely on people in the movement. I think that in the media also, therefore, the show of solidarity and the show of focus on these negative problems in society today becomes much more potent at the point at which majoritarian societies, therefore, realize that these are the everyday problems that these people are facing in the movement. I think the unity on our side of the house, again, because you have those support structures based on anger, solidarity through anger, that's when it's a lot stronger. Proud to oppose.
We thank the Leader of the Opposition for this fine speech, and we call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue this debate here. DPM?
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. I'm very, very sorry. I live in a very funny community called Kaswa. Network is not so great here. So if at any point you can't hear me, just kindly indicate in the chat so I know that you can't hear me, and I would try to sort it out. All right. So I'll be taking my POIs in the chat. I would be more than willing to facilitate a long diagonal engagement from CO, but if OO has a POI, I think they have every right to ask. So you can just use the raise hand option, because I'll just be looking there, and you can use the raise hand option and I'll know they're asking a POI since your roles are attached to your names, I guess. So yeah, my name is Prosper Michael. They, them. I'll be starting my speech in. Vincent, give me a timer. All right. So I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, we think that in status quo, there is already an approximation to the visceral known in many communities as a form of activism. We think that's what that's what people in America do with Black Lives Matter. We think that's what a lot of individuals like women and members of the LGBTQ community do. However, we foster as great a change as we think should be fostered. And this is largely because the kind of changes that they seek to incorporate are changes that happen on the policy fronts, ones that particularly, as however, is these governmental agencies are manned by individuals with prejudices and with assumptions about the communities that they are supposed to protect. The reason why we advocate for joyful militancy is because we think that that's the easiest way to restructure and re-socialize individuals within society to be able to reconstruct their perceptions and their views about these minority communities and their identity in that regard. There are two major things you get from opening opposition. One, the conversation about urgency and redress. They claim that in our world where we use joyful militancy, we water down the urgency and the pain that these individuals particularly engage in, so there's not going to be any change. Three observations in that regard. First off, we think that pain and suffering are things that are visible and perceptible. What this means is that when Black individuals are shut down in the streets of New York, people see it happen. When people are structurally extricated from positions of power, people see it happen. What this means then is that the urgency and the perceptibility of these problems is not one that is lost just because we say we want to preach joyful militancy. We think that the visible nature of these problems make it impossible for anybody to claim that they are non-existent, whether or not we are joyous. We think that what would rather be the conversation is that we are joyous in spite of these kind of things, and why that is particularly something that should engage. Second observation is the fact that we think in a world where we preach joyful militancy, my partner shows you how we get a higher level of mobilization, because non-conformists, people who are on the fence about whether or not they believe in our advocacy or not, still think this is a space they can come into and have a good time. We think what that does is that it creates an approximation to these communities. So now these individuals have direct interactions and could understand and see what goes on in these spaces. What this means then is that there's a higher proximity to an understanding of the suffering that goes on in these spaces due to the fact that they've been able to mobilize and interact with these communities. On a social front, we give you more perceptibility that can in the long run preach or necessarily translate into a higher level of noise for change in that regard. Third observation, we think that particularly the conversation of redress is one that's symmetric at best, because in a world where people have constantly pushed for the negativities that exist, we largely have not seen that great a change, largely because the individuals who are manning the positions that are supposed to change these problems still do not change much because these things exist. We think at best we can say that oh, they could claim that there will be no change in our world, but they equally do not show how there's radical change in their world. And if that is so, if there is no change at all in both worlds, we need to think of the world that gives these minorities a higher probability or a higher chance of being happy. We think our world does that because it tells them to focus on the positivities of who they are. This means that on grounds of impact, we give them a happier experience. Two, we give them higher levels of pride in who they are, because a number of these individuals constantly feel sad and reject the fact that they were born into these communities and they were born into these skin colors. We think our world gives them a certain level of value in that regard. Three, we think our world in of itself expresses the value that exists. So this means that we do not necessarily have in media streams a constant representation of Black individuals in a constant warfare between the police, but rather an expression of who we are with regards to all the positivity and all the gains and value that we hold in that regard. On that front, even if there is no change on both sides, we at least provide a certain level of good that they cannot provide in their world. We think that that's primarily important. Second observation, the second case they provide is that people are sad and they cannot express joy. We think this case is neither here nor there, and this is why. We think whilst they can argue that people are sad, and because they are sad, they don't want to engage in these festivities, we could equally argue from OG that they are actually more likely to engage in these festivities because they are sad and they need an escapist route. That is why things like Black History Month are largely looked forward to by Black individuals within America. That is why things like LGBTQ Month are things that individuals particularly want to engage. Rainbow marches are things that these guys largely want to do because they know that in the middle of all this madness, we still have a point or a time where we can be who we are and be happy within our skin. We think that's one that largely takes care of that case of their inability to express this joy. So this means that they will most probably express it. But what is the context within which this debate happen, and why do we win from opening governments? We think that people largely do not want to engage in negative militancy because of a number of reasons, which I'm going to explain. But before that, I'll take a POI from closing rather, sorry.
What is more important, to get people to join the movement or to make them act for the movement?
Yeah, the thing is that we already show you how higher mobilization means that we get a higher amount of individuals to speak in favor of these groups and point out their problems since they've seen it. So we think in the long run, we can still argue how we get more change in our side, because now we have midliners now flipping to realize the value that exists in these communities and want to advocate for it. But why is that something that is absent on Ops world? And this is very, very important. We think that current advocacy mechanisms suffer from three problems. One, compassion fatigue. People are constantly listening to the problem and they are tired of hearing about it. The reason why a lot of people have grown disinterested in the Russia-Ukraine war is because they constantly hear about it. It has constituted a large amount of compassion fatigue that leads to a higher amount of disinterest. We think this negative signaling is likely going to be one that leads to a higher propensity of disinterest, and people do not want to advocate from the flip side. Two, we think that these places are at a high propensity of radicalization. That is why during the BLM movement, a lot of their marches became violent. People do not want that. But three, there's a risk of direct harm when people engage in negative things because of the adversarial nature of it. In our world, where it is more positive and more good vibes, more people want to engage, we have better levels of return, because now more people see the problem and more people on the midline flip and want to advocate because it's all good vibes and they want to particularly be a part of that. We give you a better representation of minorities in our world. Very proud to propose.
We thank the Deputy Prime Minister for this fine speech, and I'd like to remind all speakers to please actually end your speech by 7:15. That being said, move on to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Here.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sick, thanks. There's weird music playing. I hope y'all don't have to hear it. Yeah. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I want to discuss two things in this speech. First, who better helps the numbers and do these numbers matter? And secondly, who actually cares for these individuals, these independent of social change? First, on the numbers. And here, first thing I want to point out is that OG's case rebuts itself. Because in order to be convenient and say that people already know the issue, they say that these are areas where there is a high degree of social acceptance, like the LGBTQ movement or the feminist movement in developed countries. They then say that these movements need to fear brutal police crackdowns, and that is the basis by which PMs the entire case. These cannot stand together. OG must pick one. I think they're out of this debate. But their argument is basically joyful equates to non-adversarial, safe, therefore high mobilization. First, obviously, we don't defend violence. Presumably, there are safe, non-violent methods by which you can protest. If this is about crackdowns, I'll deal with that later. But the important thing to note here is that opening government must choose between whether they get a message out or whether they get a perception of being non-adversarial. Because especially when they bring it down to it is about individuals in government who are opposed to your movement, then it is likely that these same individuals perceive you as not as adversarial, even though you are being broadly social, right, or joyful. Because for these people, they understand what you're trying to do. They have the historical knowledge to realize that this is the aim of your particular movement. That's why, for example, a lot of things get censored in developing restrictive regimes like China, even when the majority of people may not necessarily understand the reference, because the people most likely to understand the references are the ones censoring. So it's likely that a lot of the harm is symmetric. But secondly, if there is any instance of actual protest, then all of these are going to get threatened, because all of the impression that there is fear and adversarialness applies across protests, because when you join the protest, you don't know whether it will be joyful or stay joyful throughout the entire period, which undermines their own benefit. But third, their definition of joyfulness and the ability to express ends up being dependent on the police. i.e., if the police decide that something has crossed the line and is a bit too adversarial, a bit too obvious, then they crack down, which in turn means that their ability to get this expression is hugely limited on that side anyway. The question, therefore, is on which side do you get genuine mobilization? There are two things they say about why we don't. They are unresponsive to everything Amy says. The first is to say people will get tired. I think the question here is how you advocate, such as, for example, getting long-form journalism as a means of protest, changing the method, like the slogans within the protest, all of which are very possible ways in which movements have been able to succeed over time. Note that every successful movement, such as the civil rights movement, such as the suffrage movement, has done this. It is unclear why this fatigue is such a major issue. But secondly, they say there's a threat of violence from within the movement. The comparative is this. On our side, the leadership has more control because it is people who might be radical recognize that the leadership cares and is forwarding a movement along the lines of what they demand. In contrast, on your side, these same people who might be radical are not going to magically just turn joyful altogether. They are going to retain some degree of this like angst and frustration. And that means that when the movement's leadership doesn't seem to be listening to them, they are more likely to be violent because there's less goodwill between them and the leadership. So that risk happens more on your side, which then undermines all of the benefits that OG wanted to run. But one of the mechanisms we gave you for why we get mobilization that they didn't deal with. First, Amy tells you that this is really exclusive, and this is important. She tells you that other people who want to be allies but aren't part of the same movement can't partake in that dance because that's cultural appropriation, because they don't know how to. That means that the capacity for cross-movement allyship, which is often the means through which we solve for the problem of people getting tired, doesn't exist anymore on that side of the house. Secondly, it's less newsworthy. And here's what's important here as well. On our side, given the tidbit-sized nature of social media and the short attention span, a short attention span of that protest already carries across the message. On your side, you get a dance and you rely on people with a short attention spans being not just interested in that dance, but interested in the message behind the dance in order to go and get this research. But that's extremely uncertain. You are dependent on goodwill of attention-starved people. That is highly, highly unlikely to happen. But third, insofar as people don't know directly about the issue as well, because even your mechanisms and people who go don't actually show that they care about the issue. What that means is that participation in the movement doesn't equate to the subsequent mobilization that they talk about, right? That's why a lot of protest songs like Where is the Love have been de-linked from their protest messages and just become pop culture references. The same thing happens on your side of the house. On the comparative, what do we get? Three things. First, media coverage. Two, definite awareness that isn't dependent on chance. And note that people voting for you relies on awareness, not them going out to protest. So even if it's true that some fear exists, they can still vote for you and still create this change for your movement. But third, the identification through the process of anger, which got no response whatsoever. Hate is a powerful motivator in the status quo. Anger is a powerful motivator because humans are risk adverse. That's why, for example, a lot of polarization movements use hate. The problem is that on that side of the house, what's likely to happen is that people use this, like positive ideas are not sufficient to drive people to sacrifice for the movement. That's what you need, because on that side, either they don't know what's going on or they don't feel enough identity, because risk aversion means that if that happiness is seen as a joyful thing, that's something people can just trade off. That's why on balance, only we get change on our side of the house, not them. CG, if anything.
Yes. How do you think that people in power and with access to money are going to react to these sorts of protests?
Well, they react in the same way they have before, which is some level of opposition, that then when protests are able to generate change in terms of votes and change public opinion, people at the top are forced to change, because at the end of the day, they are accountable to public opinion within overwhelming majority of democracies. And even in dictatorships, because protests boil over, that becomes an instability factor for the regime. Second, who creates care for these individuals' needs? Their claim is you need identity. There are other ways to do this, right? You can have your private concerts as a group as a group, or like sell tickets to these particular concerts. The question is, why must your identity be shown, expressed in a way that is shown to others who didn't consent to viewing that particular identity? And the problem then is the backlash increases drastically on that side of the house, right? When that protest is seen as disrupting a public space, just in terms of the noise, for instance, that people won't like anyways. What that means is two things. One, even the safe space, your safe space has an association with trauma of backlash and people shouting at you and opposing your movement, which in turn loses the capacity for that to be a form of escape. But secondly, it's highly unlikely that people feel the need to express themselves against the majoritarian oppressor, for them to view vis-a-vis expressing in a way of safer space where you're able to actually partake full extent of the culture, not shouting your song over a counter protest. But further to that, what Amy tells you is important because she tells you that the most vulnerable people are not going to be hurt on that side. All of PM's claims of agency are speculative and dependent on all of the earlier things actually changing. What they ignored, therefore, is Amy's analysis that it's the feeling and process of being gagged, coercive process of that movement that doesn't want to get any backlash from the government that hurts and excludes people who want to do this protest, independent of whether rationally and objectively they have been hurt. That is how we oppose.
We thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for this fine speech, and we call upon the Member of Government to open back Wolff. Hear, hear.
All right. Hello, hello, hello. Am I audible?
Yes.
Perfect. One sec. Cool. Okay. I'm starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Positive messages generate political and corporate support and convince the average voter more than violent or whatever the kinds of protests that we have today. Those are going to be my 2 cases. Before I do that, I'm just going to do 3 points of major rebuttal. 1, we hear that there is a trade-off and that people tomorrow don't feel like things are urgent enough. I say this is not true at all. Female Safety Month definitely raises awareness that there is a problem regarding safety. It just provides a way of addressing that, or a way of fun of showing people you can go out safely in some ways, but that doesn't mean there isn't a problem today. The same for the Pride Parade, where people say, oh, I would like to be able to marry, but also I know how to have fun and am a person who you would enjoy spending time with. We then hear that people lose members because they feel unrepresented. I'd say 2 things about this. 1, this assumes that the average person within the minority doesn't enjoy themselves or feels like all that defines them is the struggle, rather than things like their heritage, their ability to enjoy themselves despite their circumstances. I think many people do want to believe that they can enjoy themselves despite their circumstances. Secondly, I think that the delta that opening opposition can prove here is much lower because these people don't have any other options. There is no other movement that will support them. And so they are likely, because especially if as opening opposition says their lives are really shit, they're likely to still do a lot of work there and still need a lot of, and still want to be supported and change. Then we hear finally that people retrain frustration and are going to be more violent anyway. 1, this assumes that we are less successful. Notice if we show that we achieve more political change, they have no reason to be violent. But secondly, it also assumes that people have the tools, they have the money, they have the connection, they have the time to organize a massive violent protest on the fly. I think this is just very unlikely, and so I do not think that the comparative is people massively protest in bad ways anyway, even after we do this. Okay, so let's get into the cases. Firstly, why do we think this gains way more political and economic support? 1, I think there's a lot less backlash. Today, it's very hard to support a lot of these movements because you can point at all kinds of bad things that these people do and support. An example of this, a classic one, is violent protest of Black Lives Matter, where a lot of the times politicians in the States or Trump try to paint anyone who supports Black Lives Matter as violent, as not being positive, not having ideas how to make changes, as just complaining, as being criminals, and things like that. And that means that other politicians find it difficult to take part or difficult to support these people. Notice, in contrast to what we hear from opening opposition, I think that a lot of the time politicians do want to support because they know they'll get votes from this, or because some of them might literally just be allies. They might come from minority backgrounds themselves, or believe that helping minorities is a good thing, and we need to enable them to do that. And reducing the amount of backlash that they face for helping minorities will help do that a ton. Secondly, I also think that there's a lot more positive coverage on our side. Why? 4 structural reasons. A, it's a lot more fun. Right? When things are very serious, when all you're seeing is, oh, this number of people died, this number of things there, etc., it's very difficult to get excited. It's very difficult to enjoy yourself, and most of the time, people don't want to cover that. It's kind of depressing. So when you put that on the news, people kind of turn it off. Secondly, it's a lot less novel. Oftentimes, it's the same kinds of things, using the same numbers, you're running the same protests, you're doing it's the same message over and over again. When it's fun, it's much more personal, because when you go and you see something fun, then you're talking to somebody from the crowd who's having a fun time, and they have a unique take on this. They have their own version of doing this. They look different, they've dressed differently, etc., etc. So it's much more engaging. Like literally violent or whatever. Sorry, the other kinds of protests are just boring. It's people walking around with cards being like, "We're against this thing. We're against this thing." On the comparative, look at the Gay Pride Parade. Flamboyant, enjoyable, music. Like there's so much. It's much the kind of thing that you want to take part in, that you want to look at, you want to see. And this. Also on the other side, oftentimes it's cliques. Even when it's something that's kind of novel, I don't know, there are bodies on the floor with blood around them, it's often difficult for you to understand without having the context. And it's also something that, and that means that oftentimes in terms of media coverage, there's much less incentive to cover. And finally, approachability. Like when people are mad, they're hard to approach, they're hard to talk to. When people are having fun and engaging, they're much easier to. So for all these reasons, you have a lot more media coverage, a lot more journalists going and asking people what they're thinking, getting yourself out on platforms, a lot more. And this is exactly the kind of way where you generate public support, where people want to look at you, where people actually even hear about your message. And obviously, when this means that politicians themselves can derive immediate benefit by supporting you. When they go to these rallies, they know they're going to get a lot of public positive support and coverage, and this is going to be really good for them. Thirdly, potential for profit. Listen, there's just a lot more ways to earn money from this, right? Most of the positive things have things like corporate sponsors. You look at the Gay Pride Parade with selling Excels or things like that. Now, okay, yes, we're taking help from corporations, but this kind of money and funding allows us to help open our hotlines, support people within our movement in all sorts of ways they need, pay for court cases, do all the different things that we need to do in order to actually win our legal battles. And if by making things fun, we get more money, that is a great trade-off to take. And what this means is that we have way more political power in 3 ways. One, the influence locuses that we just change politicians, and we enable politicians to make these changes by making them suffer from backlash. Secondly, we get way more change because the amount of money and funding we have enables us to both drive change and take care of our weakest members in much, much better ways. Before I continue to my second point about why people respond better to positive messages, I'll take a POI from close it. Open it. Yes, close it. Go.
We're not so sure as why do we need the support. We think we already got most of the low-hanging fruits, and now the changes we need are more structural, which you can't get.
Great. That assumes that you've already gotten most of your support, which would be if you've already won. I don't think that's the case. Many movements are just trying to gain traction. So you'd be talking about a far smaller number of movements. And secondly, oftentimes the most difficult part is translating widespread public support into actual political action, because that's the place where you need to convince decision makers, where they need to put that on the ballot and all sorts of things like that. So why do we think that people also respond better to positive messages? One, because it's just more enjoyable, and when people are having fun, they are more predisposed to listen to you, right? When you're positive, people are like, I want to be around positive people. Secondly, this creates an association between your movement and enjoyment. So they link this together on a subconscious level. When they think of fun, they think about the Pride Parade, right? And on the comparative, when they think of, things are kind of shitty, they think of the Big Pride Parade, that means that you're less likely to see support. It feels more constructive. It looks like you're trying to solve the problem. You're looking at how you can raise awareness for women's safety by advocating how they can keep themselves safe. And this means that you're much less open to criticism and also providing way more benefits to the people who support you. Secondly, you also seem much less adversarial. Today, there is a lot of you're often viewed as blaming the other side, as blaming the public, because you need to give reasons for the harms that are happening, and oftentimes that's the majority, because you want to create a common enemy to focus on and mobilize. But on the comparative, and what that means is that people often feel attacked. People feel like they're being held responsible for your problem. And most of the time, that's not a good way to convince people. The way to convince people is to make them see you, to make them identify with you, to make them sympathetic to your cause. If they feel like you're blaming them, they don't want to listen to you. They want to tell you why you're wrong, and you're not to, and they're not to blame, and you're to blame for that scenario. That means that you're much, much less convincing and way easier to misunderstand. Please vote.
We thank the member of the government for his fine speech and call upon the member of the opposition to continue this debate. Hear, hear.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, so before I begin, 2 things. 1, trigger warning for potential watchers at home or for people listening. Mentions of trauma in the speech. Second of all, POIs in chat, please. So I will begin my speech in 3, 2, 1, and very important piece of framing, which is going to come to you from CO. Importantly, we tell you at these events of joyful militancy, it is likely that everyone are going to try to keep the peace and not cause conflicts within them. Why? 3 reasons. Number 1, the public itself, when it is invited to an event of joyful militancy, is likely to do backlash in the case where conflict arises within the event. People are kicked out, there's a inter-protest or backlash of bad actors within the event or anything like that, and are likely to shut the event down, are likely to not have any event matters again. This is hugely matter for those who are organizing the event, who obviously want the public to attend. Secondly, the exact financial incentives that CG put in, that money now pours in from actors, from people selling merch within the event, or people advertising within it, is likely to make them want to keep the peace, to not cause any of the backlash within the event, to make it as accessible as possible to everyone, no matter their political leanings, and to not actually make the good actors within the event and not to actually prioritize the good actors within. Thirdly, it is the fact that activist pressures within. It is the fact that the activists within the movement are far more likely to view these events as also good for themselves, as them coming out to enjoy the event, are far less likely to actually do what activists today do, that whenever, say, TERFs come into a feminist event, they're likely to kick them out, and they're far more likely to just want the event to continue and not cause the organizers to change anything. Note, organizers are usually motivated in these events by money. They want their money back, they want to recuperate on that, and they want popularity, and not necessarily the most well-moral or meaning actors, so they're not likely to keep these actors in check. Why is this important? First extension, bad actors within the social movements, bad goals that the social movements are going to advocate for. Note, this is prior to the entire debate, because everyone until now assumed that people converting to the social movement is a necessary good. We tell you, if we prove to you that the social movements are going to be far worse, then we necessarily win on that. Several mechanizations, since we're prior to everyone else, because the entire point of the social movement is to get goals. Several mechanisms here. First of all, opportunists joining the social movements. What are we talking about? Exactly CG's type of politician support. Lockheed Martin marching for Pride, politicians coming into the event and saying, oh, we support you so much. Problem, CG at no fucking point proved to you that in any case, these politicians are actually going to do anything good with that support. These politicians have every single incentive to come into the event to say, yes, we support you, but to not actually do anything in practice, because if they do so, they will receive more backlash from the other side. Note, CGs, they receive backlash is symmetrical, with the extent that the backlash against the movement is likely to arise from political movements on the other side, of HUJI charities not working on that, of politicians on the other side, and therefore the backlash is symmetrical. But on our side, we sense the framing of keeping the peace. We lose the ability to actually criticize them and to move them into any better position. Whereas on our side, for them to support us and get our vote, they actually need to show that they're doing good stuff for us and that they're actually supporting us. On that extent, the social movement becomes useless because because a lot of politicians and other opportunists hijack it. Secondly, it is bad actors within the social movement. We're talking about, say, TERFs. We're talking about black supremacists. People who use the social movement, which is as like a theoretical good, for bad ends or converted for bad ends. Note, it is the easiest for them to use these joyful militancy activists in order to get activism on self. TERFs come, or black supremacists come into the movement, and they use coded words such as, we protect biological women, look how great we are, or we want to empower the black man or the specific ethnicity, and they use that in order to get more converts without them receiving any backlash on it within the social movement, because again, keeping the peace, and likely it is the fact that activists are not going to want to kick them out and cause all of that backlash. This means that now we're getting far more TERFs and other bad actors who are corrupting the movement from within, far less of an ability to criticize them, and the social movement becomes far worse and converts towards bad goals. See this already happening in TERF Island, Britain, where essentially all of the pride parades and larger amount have been taken over by these groups whenever they're most peaceful. But lastly, it is literally about bad social movements. I don't get why all of this debate assumes that all social movements are necessarily good. Note, extreme religious movements, white supremacy, anti-LGBT movements are all social movements by definition, but they're all very, very, very harmful. They use this tactic of joyful militancy in order to get supporters. How does it seem? Like they do stuff such as pro-family events, or like a daycare or Sunday schools or all of that, in order to get people in order to change their biases, because they know that most people don't like their opinions when expressed in public, but when they come into nice community events and all of that, they get easily converted. To that extent, we now get a lot more of when they use joyful militancy, we oppose everyone. Like this debate is about all social movements, we oppose everyone, because that means that comparatively they get far more power, whereas on our side, all of the good social movements can just, show their opinions that they want equality and human rights for everyone, where these opinions have far less of an ability to actually stand. What do we get from this point? A, far less of an ability of the good social movements to actually work, to be recuperated. B, far more corruption for them being converted to far more bad goals. C, far worse social movements. Before we continue to the public, I would be happy to take OG.
So the problem with your case is that it is largely dependent on CG's case of monetization of these festivities. Our case says that you need to be able to engage the idea of them being expression, of there being expression for these movements, and that the minorities having a chance to show their value.
Our case is not dependent on that. I've already gave three mechanisms: public, finance, and activism. You only said one, and even if it's one, it's a relatively strong one. Again, organizers are motivated by financial gain. That's what the thing is likely in most cases to look like. But let's also do an even. Let's say that all social movements are good, that the previous case had no standing, and let's just show to why more people get converted to social movements on our side. Very important framing here. sell to you more coverage, but never actually explain to you what does more coverage lead to or why is it required. This is an important thing because we tell you that what matters is not simply just convincing people to join your side, but actually changing their priority of orders. Because people are convinced by many different things, like they have many different issues on their table, but they're not necessarily prioritize the most material. They might say support the LGBT movement, but not actually vote for the LGBT politician, but for the other side, because, for example, their economic policy or other policy which is more important to them. What you need for that is a specific tipping point to convert their own priorities to be much more important to your side, because without that, OGs and CGs cases of people joining the movement become useless because they don't ever actually support it strongly. Note here, how do we get that? First of all, on a shock, we get far more shock value on our side. We get when you are not constrained by the fact that you need to prove a positive event, when you are not constrained by the fact that you need to show positivity, and you can actually reach out for more shock stories, we get more shock stories in this event, more stories of conversion therapy being used and how terrible it is, more stories of women being raped and how terrible they are. This shock causes people's biases to break, it causes their sticky priorities to change, when a lot of the times they have biases towards their own lives, towards their own goals, or towards what they think is already important, which changes that and also makes them remember them far more. But also, this anger uniquely acts as a tipping point where it creates a meaningful community, not just another community where you can enjoy the events and be prideful, such as all of your fucking hobbies. A community where you uniquely find anger, a community where other people uniquely support you through all of your worst experiences in life. This means far more unity, far more shock, and actually people's priorities being converted and meaningfully joining your side and not just supporting you to no avail and no voting or whatever. This is doubly true for activists uniquely, who are people who actually needs to join and dedicate a lot of the time for your movement. There is a people who needs to like stand and do a lot of stuff. So you need the priority list to move in their movement by a factor, and this priority movement is unique to our side. And through that, we think that CEO has done a very good job in this debate. Probably call you to oppose. Thank you very much.
We thank the member of the opposition for this fine speech and call upon the government whip to finish this debate. Hear, hear.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Excellent. Wow, that was great. My pen just snapped open. POIs exclusively in the chat, please. Begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 central clashes within this debate. The first is the ability to affect policy and how much power we have within the world. The second is the types of policies or the awareness of what issues we manage to raise within our movement. And the last is whether we create safe spaces, which is, and I'm just going to wait that out of the debate. But first, let's engage with what we just heard from CG. This issue of co-opting the movement, which is the central CG case, depends on a lot of very unlikely things. The first is it depends on the active stupidity of the leaders of the movement and their inability to recognize people who are interacting with them with nefarious goals, inability to not allow politicians who aren't actually doing anything to use their platform and simply not have them join in, not let them onto the stage of the protest because they say, well, over time you haven't shown any actual benefits to us, so we don't have any incentive to cooperate with you. Their incentive not to cooperate, generally just they're being, oh, you know what, you seem nice, fine, you can do whatever you want. That seems like such an unlikely characterization of people who are intelligent and skillful enough to mobilize an entire movement of people, to organize protests, to make contact with media people and make these sorts of interactions of public relations. They don't sound like they are that idiotic. The second is the only mechanism towards this is this idea of, oh, but they're avoiding violence, they're avoiding conflict. But that does not equal everyone can join and have as much power as they want under any condition. That's not what that means. Avoiding a violent protest means, yes, you will probably distance from those protests people who you think are likely to disrupt the public environment and things like that. It does not mean that anyone who shows up and wants to take part in the protest but has nothing to do with your movement, you're just going to let them do that and you're going to let them participate. And it definitely does not mean that you are going to throw your capital behind people or individuals who don't stand for what you believe in as a movement. There's no reason that you have to do that. The conflict of distancing someone from the movement is not the same kind of conflict as actively having a protest that is walking in the streets and blaming people for your problems and smashing windows and things like that. That's just not what the debate is even about. Now, next on this whole thing of like some social movements are bad and they're the ones benefiting. Note that in order for this to be a net harm from the overall debate, you have to show that these bad movements are enough in number and are receiving enough more benefit, that they overcome whatever benefits are achieved by the positive movements. The only explanation we receive for this being the case is, oh, but only bad movements are seen as bad, and so this sort of whitewashing benefits them, whereas movements that are moving for positive social change are anyway, everyone thinks that they're great and no one backlashes against them at all. But the thing is that this whole equality, they're just fighting for equality, so who would object? Makes no sense whatsoever. Correcting for equality means actively taking from those who currently have more and redressing that. That is a huge incentive for backlash and a reason for people to not want to cooperate with you if your messaging is around the fact that you have something that ought to belong to us and give it to us back. That is precisely the sort of situation in which you get enormous backlash, and these sorts of movements trying to correct these unfair divisions are going to really have an uphill battle and need to message and to present themselves in a positive light in order to garner support and in order to avoid these sorts of negative reactions. This also deals with the whole thing of, oh, well, backlash to politicians is symmetrical on both sides. No, it is not, because the thing that most encourages backlash happens a lot more on opposition side than it does on ours. Now, note that these negative movements tend to be relatively rare, and their ability to actually gain political traction is a lot more limited, because regardless of how they frame themselves, when they try to pass a policy, which is an actively harmful policy or anti-democratic policy, A, there are systems in place to prevent these policies from happening, and B, those policies are going to look very, very problematic to the general public, regardless of how they got to the point of trying to pass that policy. There's going to be a lot of anger to anyone trying to pass this sort of idea. Now, why do we think that we win on the ability to affect policy and the ability to affect actual outcomes? Because we think OG and OO argue over whether there are more minority members of the minority who join or not, but crucially are missing how this leads to active policy change. And at best, what they have is, oh, politicians are beholden to public opinion. There's no explanation how a minority manages to create the majoritarian public opinion. They maybe say, oh, we get more support or less support, but not where they achieve some majority that then all politicians are going to suddenly listen to. But also, they crucially do not deal with the counterfactors of political influence, such as lobbying, such as corporate influences, such as backlash from other political actors and from your political people who cooperate with you. Yishai crucially comes in and fills that gap. He shows you how you get a lot more funding. He shows you how you're more likely to be able to lobby, you're more likely to create support, you're more likely to be able to advertise, because you cooperate with these sorts of corporate actors that give you those crucial resources. And he also shows why politicians have a lot less to lose by actually cooperating with you. Now, why is that so much more important than these minorities? A, note that these minorities are just a lot more symmetrical. They have an incentive to take part in these movements on both sides because they're still losing something they want to actively redress. Also, they're more likely to be dragged by a friend because it's more likely they know someone who's part of the movement and they will bring them to take part of the movement. And they're more likely to have, say, grown up in a home where this was present, where people were talking about this movement and it's important and want to participate. This is not true of politicians and corporations that are totally removed from this group and less likely to cooperate. So the impact is just a lot greater, or the delta is a lot greater. Also, they're just less effective for creating this change, as I just explained, because they don't address the crucial needs for change that our solutions do. Before I continue, opening.
Yep. If people's willingness to join the movement is dependent on it being happy and non-confrontational, or to fund the movement, how do you call out majorities for their oppressive views, like prioritizing their own crime and safety over less tough policing, and thus create any capacity for actual change?
Because we think that at the point that these people join, and that's the point that they are a lot more capable of understanding the individuals that they are standing in front of and feel a lot less attacked and sense of loss. And this is where we come into the types of policies and issues raised. Because Yishai crucially comes in and explains to you how when we bridge the sympathy gap, that is when these issues become relevant and you are likely to cooperate with them. Because it's harder to object to these movements for external reasons of, oh, they create external harms. I don't care, their message might be good, but look, they're doing really bad things. You have to object purely to the message because what they're doing is absolutely unobjectable. At that point, people are discussing the message more. People are becoming more aware of the issues. And it's a lot more likely that individuals from the general public are actually going to want to participate in this issue and not being distracted. The second, they're also far less likely to activate their defense mechanism because they're not being told, you so bad, you stole our land. They're just being told, hey, I'm your friend. You want to make sure that I am happy because I want to be happy too. And that is when we get that active change. Lastly, on why safe spaces are not important. First off, we think that they are achieved outside of activism, other ways of getting them. Second, we think that we affect material reality, which is more important. And third, we think that policy change affects everyone, not just those who participate in the movement. Please propose.
We thank the government whip for his fine speech, and for the last speech of this round, we call upon the opposition whip. Hear, hear.
Hi guys, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, great. So just a second. So, okay. Okay, starting in 3. Oh, firstly, POIs in chat. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Firstly, notice that CG never really answers our point about the shock value, about how we are getting the tipping point on our side, and so we think they fail to engage with the big portion of our case. We think that's important to note this panel. Let's talk about 2 clashes in this debate. Firstly, where we are getting better goals of our movement. Secondly, where we are getting supporters that were actually inflict change in the real world. Let's start with goals because we think this is the most important clash. Why do we think this is the most important clash? Why are we winning this? Firstly, we think that even if we have support of the movement, what is actually determining if we succeed or not are the goals themselves. Why? Because firstly, if we have better goals, more activists come, and those are activists that sympathize more with our goals and the things that we want to achieve. We think that those activists will be the ones that are doing the lobbying, that are giving us money, and we think they are better at that because they have the motivation of actually being good, because it is something that is concerning to them. So we think we are just simply getting more lobbying on our side when we are getting better activists. Secondly, we think that if we have a movement that is actively bad for us, actively not giving us the good goals, we are actively harming ourselves. We can see that, for example, in the feminist movement, when if we focus about problems of privileged white women, which is enabling women that are less privileged from actually accessing many of the benefits that the movement can give them. And so this is just a time waste, and also it is a smoke screen because people think that the goals that were achieved, and actually we're not getting them the change they actually need. We are harming ourselves. We are shooting ourselves at the back. And so if we show to you that we're getting better goals, we are winning on this metric. Where does OO fail in this? The place where OO is trying to show us that the goals of the movement are becoming better is when they say that some people are not sympathizing with the movement when it's so happy, and so they won't join in. We think, firstly, that OG already say that there is still an interest to be inside because you are connected to the joy, you are creating escapism. So we think this clash of whether people will join, not join, is becoming symmetrical to a certain point, or at least a wash. Why does Guy brings it to our table, and why are we winning this point? We think that Guy actually proves to you structurally of why people are joining the movement, and why people that are extremely vulnerable and marginalized are getting more place inside of the movement. He tells you that it is because today inside of those joy parades, people are not joining because organizing themselves are driven by this financial force. They don't want to be ruined because there is a marketing value of the event, because they want their money back, because other actors, for example, TERF women, don't want them, and actively they are oppressing people that want to show a different perspective because they don't want them there, because they see them as someone that is not part of the norm. We think those reasons are simply much more important than what came to us in opening half, because if opening half was contingent on whether people would choose to join or not, we are saying people have an incentive to join anyway. We are showing you other actors that are actively those people to join by themselves. Why do we think we are winning this clash? Firstly, we think we're getting much less of a minority opinions inside of the movement that are getting covered, that are changing the goals of the movement in a way that will be beneficial to us, in a way that will help us to actually move to better goals. But secondly, the opportunists that Gaia is talking about, and the problem we have with them. Well, what is our problem with, for example, Lockheed Martin sponsoring Pride Parade? We think that now we are not helping ourselves, not giving ourselves the opportunity to criticize them, and we think many of the times those are the factors that actually lead our criticism. We think that it is critical because now we have many of the low-hanging fruit, for example, for the feminist movement, meaning that we don't need their financial support, but moreover, we need our activists, our own persons, and we're simply not getting them when we can't criticize the bodies that are giving us money to continue this movement. And so we think THBT is actually out of this debate because they are not allowing the movement to be functioning correctly, because it is making us driven by the interest of power groups, and we think this is simply very, very bad for us. But secondly, we think that the bad actors, for example, TERF women are very bad for us, and notice that this is where Naomi, closing opposite government whip, is not responding, because we think that the leaders are not stupid, but they have no incentive to push aside the happy activists for the not happy activists, because both of them are part of the movement. And so we think we have this direct expression of some of the movements over other of the movement. And the last thing that we think is crucial is that we have now less criticism of the media. We think it's extremely important. First, because other like media, etc., can give us valuable criticism that we are just not getting today. And Guy talks about that directly when he talks to her about bad movements and everything like that. We're not getting this criticism. We can change. This means that we're getting worse movements on our side. It means that we're hurting ourselves, and we think this is extremely important. Yes, CG.
Shock value is a one-off benefit which can't be sustained and actively distances politicians and corporations because their currency is positive association, and they are the critical sources of power.
We don't care about politicians. We don't care about anything. We care about people to remember our movement, and we care about people going past the tipping point of actually caring about our movement enough to do the lobbying. We don't think that politicians, for example, will remember the shock value, but we think that the citizens that hears about a woman being raped is caring, is the lobbying we actually do. Let's talk about supporters, because we think that the main wing we have above OO here is that they never showed you a tipping point. They talk about how hatred is good. We don't know why this is a thing that is actually making people connected. We don't know why people will do it into this hatred. They talk about the tension span. Again, they never showed us why people actually opt into the attention span and to care about that. You need to care why does he win the debate? Because he shows you why shock value of those stories, of those terrible stories, are the ones that are making people remember the movement for the long term. B, forcing people to have an interaction with the movement in a way that is valuable. C, changing their preferences in the way that now they care because they see how bad someone is being harmed, because they want to stop that, because they don't want this person to be harmed anymore. This is the tipping point that OO never proved to you. We are winning on OG on rebuttals on the first test, and so we are winning the debate as a whole. Call you to oppose.
We thank the opposition whip for this fine speech. I thank the whole room for a nice debate. I call upon. Sorry, I call upon